when a biker punched an elderly black woman in a crowded cafe, knocking her unconscious because he believed people like her didn't belong there. He had no idea who her son was. Just a few tables away, her son sat frozen in shock. An off-duty Navy SEAL. He watched in horror as his own mother collapsed to the ground. What happened next, and how the SEAL reacted, was something no one inside that cafe was prepared for. Before we start, comment where you're watching from today. I love to know where everyone is watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Now, let's go back to the moment it all began. The coffee cup was still rising toward her lips when the fist connected. That's how fast it happened. 1 second, 75-year-old Evelyn Carter was sitting in a vinyl booth, hands wrapped around a warm ceramic mug, watching the door the way she always did when she was waiting for someone she loved. The next second, a sound like a bat cracking against wood split through the noise of the room, and Evelyn was gone. Not there anymore. Her body folding sideways like something had cut the strings holding her up. Her glasses left her face before she hit the floor. They skidded across the tile in slow motion, spinning once, twice, before coming to a stop underneath the neighboring booth. One lens cracked clean down the middle. The cafe went completely, terrifyingly silent. A child near the window stopped crying. A waitress froze mid-pour, hot coffee crawling over the edge of a mug and burning her fingers. But she didn't move. A teenage boy in the back booth had his phone halfway to his face, and he couldn't finish the motion. A mother near the door instinctively pulled her daughter's face into her chest so the little girl wouldn't see. Nobody breathed. On the floor, between the table leg and the napkin holder that had fallen with her, Evelyn Carter lay completely still. A thin line of red traced from the corner of her mouth, moving slowly across the white tile, finding the grout lines the way water always finds the cracks. She was a retired school teacher, a grandmother figure to hundreds of children in this town, a woman who had never raised her voice in anger, never started a fight, never given anyone a single reason to fear her. She was 75 years old, and she had just been knocked unconscious in the middle of a Tuesday morning. The man who did it, Derek Malone, known to everyone who feared him as Razor, was still standing over her. 6'3", 240 pounds, wearing a leather cut with a snake logo stitched across the back. He wasn't looking at Evelyn anymore. He was scanning the room instead, meeting eyes with everyone who dared to hold his gaze, daring them, begging them, almost, to say something. Nobody did. Outside, on the street where the spring morning was still going about its normal business, a black pickup truck was pulling slowly into the parking lot. The driver cut the engine, sat for a moment, then opened the door. He was tall, lean, with the kind of stillness about him that you don't see often. The stillness of someone who has learned to be quiet in places where noise gets people killed. His name was Caleb Carter, and the woman bleeding on the floor of that cafe was his mother. He didn't know that yet, but he was about to find out. And when he did, nothing inside that building would ever be the same. To understand what happened inside the Beacon Cafe on that Tuesday morning, you have to first understand who Evelyn Carter was. Because the people who heard her thought they knew. They looked at her and saw exactly what they wanted to see. A small, gray-haired woman who wouldn't fight back. They saw vulnerability. They saw an easy target. They were wrong on every single count. Evelyn Marie Carter was born in 1949 in Harlan County, Kentucky, the third of 6 children in a family that had very little money but an abundance of something rarer, dignity. Her mother worked double shifts at a textile plant. Her father drove a coal truck 6 days a week. Neither of them complained. Both of them believed, with the fierce and stubborn certainty of people who had no other choice, that the way you treated other people was the only thing in this world that truly defined you. Evelyn had taken that lesson and built her entire life around it. She started teaching at Millbrook Elementary School in 1974, when she was 25 years old, and she didn't stop for 40 years. 40 years of first graders who couldn't read and left her classroom reading chapter books. 40 years of children who came to school in dirty clothes or hungry or carrying bruises that nobody talked about. And Evelyn saw them. She always saw them. And she found ways to make sure they knew that at least one adult in this world cared whether they made it. She was the kind of teacher people write about in obituaries. The kind people travel back to their hometowns to visit. Dozens of her former students had shown up at her retirement party in 2014, some of them 40 years old by then, some of them with children of their own, all of them saying some version of the same thing. She changed my life. Her husband, Robert Carter, had died of a heart attack in 2019. After 41 years of marriage, Evelyn had gone through the terrible mathematics of grief, sorting through his clothes, learning to cook for one, getting used to the sound of a house that had always been loud and was suddenly, inexplicably quiet. She had survived that, because Evelyn Carter had always found a way to survive. But surviving alone is not the same as living. And in the years since Robert's death, the thing that made her feel most alive was the phone that rang on Sunday evenings, and the voice on the other end, slightly distorted by satellite connection, sometimes crackling with static from 12,000 miles away, that said, "Hey, Mom, it's me. Caleb." Her son, her one child, the great complicated love of her life. Caleb Carter had not had an easy start. He'd been a difficult teenager, not cruel, not criminal, but unfocused in a way that worried her. Restless, angry at something he couldn't name. He dropped out of community college after one semester, bounced between jobs, and Evelyn had spent a long stretch of his early 20s on her knees praying that he'd find something to anchor him before he drifted somewhere she couldn't reach. Then, at 23, he'd walked into a Navy recruiting office in downtown Louisville, and everything had changed. Not immediately. Nothing about the military is immediate. But over the years, Evelyn had watched her restless, unfocused boy transform into something extraordinary. He went through basic underwater demolition training. He failed the first time, broke his collarbone in week 3, and came back and did it again. He earned his SEAL designation at 26. He deployed to Afghanistan, then Iraq, then to places his mother wasn't allowed to know about, in countries she wasn't supposed to name. He was 38 now, and he was finally, after 14 months away, coming home. That Tuesday morning, Evelyn had gotten his call at 7:15 a.m. "Mom, I'm in the States. I'm driving in tonight, but I'll be near Millbrook by 10. You want to meet me somewhere? That cafe you used to love. The Beacon? You still go there?" She'd laughed. "I haven't been there in years," she'd said. "But I'll be there. 10 o'clock. Don't be late." She'd put the phone down, smiled at the photograph of Robert on her nightstand, and started getting ready. She put on her blue cardigan, the one Caleb had sent from overseas 3 Christmases ago. She made sure her hearing aid was working. She took her blood pressure medication. She picked up her purse. She had no idea what was waiting for her. But something shifted the moment she pulled open the door of the Beacon Cafe and stepped inside. The place she remembered, warm, familiar, safe, had become something else entirely. The Beacon Cafe had been a fixture of Millbrook for 30 years. Family-run, cash only on Tuesdays, famous for a blueberry pie that people drove 40 minutes out of their way to eat. Evelyn and Robert had come here on their anniversary every year for 2 decades. She'd brought Caleb here as a little boy for hot chocolate after his school Christmas concerts. She'd sat in this exact booth, the second one from the door, on the left, for some of the best mornings of her life. That Tuesday morning, she pushed open the glass door and stopped. The first thing she noticed was the sound. The Beacon had always been a quiet place, murmured conversation, the occasional clink of silverware, music turned low enough that you had to lean in to identify the song. Now it was loud in a way that felt aggressive. Not festive loud, territorial loud, like a sound designed to tell everyone within earshot that something here had been claimed. The second thing she noticed was the motorcycles. There were 11 of them lined up in the parking lot, chrome gleaming in the morning sun, all facing the same direction like some kind of military formation. Each one had the same patch on the front fender, a coiled serpent with a dagger through its head. She'd noticed them on her way in but assumed they belonged to a group passing through. People were allowed to stop for breakfast, but they hadn't passed through. They were still here, and they had, by the look of it, been here for a while. The Iron Serpents Motorcycle Club had been operating in the eastern Kentucky and southern Ohio region for 11 years. On paper, they were a recreational riding club, bikers who liked the road and each other's company. In practice, law enforcement agencies in 3 counties had been watching them for the better part of 4 years, building a case file that included suspected involvement in illegal firearms distribution, extortion of local businesses, and at least 2 assaults that had gone unreported because the victims were too afraid to cooperate with investigators. They numbered about 40 members in the region. 14 of them were in the Beacon Cafe that morning. Evelyn didn't know any of that. What she knew was that the energy in the room felt wrong, the way a change in air pressure feels wrong before a storm. The waitresses moved quickly, heads down, not making eye contact with the tables near the windows where the leather-jacketed men sat spread out and loud. 2 of the men nearest the door tracked her with their eyes as she walked in. Neither of them smiled. She thought briefly about leaving. Then she remembered Caleb's voice on the phone, tired but warm, closer than he'd been in over a year, and she found the second booth on the left and she sat down. She ordered coffee. Black, no sugar, same as always. She waited. For a few minutes, nothing happened. She wrapped both hands around the mug and watched the door and told herself she was being silly. It was a cafe. Other people were here. 2 older men at the counter, a young woman with a laptop near the back, the mother with the little girl by the window. Just people, going about their morning. Then the shadow fell across her table. She looked up. The man standing over her booth was enormous, not just tall but wide, built like someone who had spent decades making himself as physically intimidating as possible. He wore a leather vest over a dark flannel shirt, and across the back of the vest was the Iron Serpents logo, that coiled snake, grinning, the dagger-catching light that wasn't there. He had a beard that was going gray at the edges and small, pale eyes that didn't seem to focus on anything directly. They moved across everything like something was always being evaluated. His name was Derek Malone. He'd been going by Razor since he was 22, when he'd used exactly that to resolve a dispute over a drug debt in Cincinnati. He was 47 now, and he had never once in his life been held accountable for anything he'd done. That, more than anything else, was what had made him into what he was. He looked down at Evelyn Carter, her blue cardigan, her silver hair, her hands around her coffee cup, and his lip curled. "You lost, Grandma. This ain't your kind of place." A few of the men at the nearby tables laughed. Evelyn felt it, the low, rolling cruelty of that laughter, the way it was designed to reduce her, to make her feel small and exposed. She'd felt that energy in classrooms before, 40 years of it, from children who hadn't yet learned that cruelty was a weakness dressed up as strength. She'd never been afraid of it then. She wasn't going to start now. She looked up at Razor calmly. "I'm waiting for my son," she said. "Thank you for your concern." She looked back at the door. Razor stared at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his face. Not anger. Exactly. Something wise. The particular irritation of a man who expected submission and had not received it. He walked away. But he didn't leave her alone. He never intended to leave her alone. The next 20 minutes were a slow, methodical campaign of intimidation. Razor went back to his table, but he positioned his chair so he was facing Evelyn's booth directly. He watched her in a way that wasn't subtle, the kind of watching that's meant to be noticed, that's meant to communicate something. One of his men pulled up a chair beside him and leaned in, and they spoke quietly, and then both of them looked at her, and then they both laughed. The waitress who'd taken Evelyn's order found a reason to stop by twice in the next 15 minutes, small acts of solidarity that Evelyn noticed and appreciated. The second time, she leaned down slightly while refilling the coffee and said, very quietly, You can wait in the back if you want, honey. Near the kitchen. Evelyn thanked her and stayed where she was. She understood, on some level, what the waitress was telling her. But the booth by the door was where Caleb would see her first when he came in. She wasn't going to move to the back of the restaurant so that a group of men who had made no contribution to this town could have the run of it. She'd spent 40 years teaching children that you don't let the bully win by walking away. She wasn't going to unlearn that lesson at 7 to 5. At 9:47, Reza came back. This time he didn't stand over her booth. He slid into the seat across from her. Just sat down, uninvited, in Robert's seat. The seat where her husband used to sit on Sunday mornings when they'd share a single newspaper and argue about the crossword answers. Evelyn looked at him. "Why are you still here?" he said. His voice was low, conversational, almost friendly. That was the part that chilled the room more than if he'd been yelling. The men at the nearby tables had gone quiet. "I told you," Evelyn said. "I'm waiting for my son." "Yeah, your son." He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "What's he going to do about it? Call the police?" More laughter from the tables around them. A man near the window whistled. Someone said something Evelyn couldn't make out, and several of them laughed harder. She held Reza's gaze. "He'll be here soon," she said. "You should probably be finished with your breakfast by then." For just a second, she thought she saw something flicker in Reza's eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or something darker, the recalibration of a predator who has misjudged the situation and doesn't know yet how to process it. Then he reached out slowly and pressed one finger against the rim of her coffee mug and pushed. Just slightly, just enough to send a thin stream of coffee spilling across the table, soaking through the paper napkin, spreading toward the edge. Evelyn didn't flinch, didn't pull the cup away, didn't say a word. She just looked at him. Reza stood up. He lingered for a moment, making sure everyone in the room saw him standing over her, making sure the moment was witnessed, catalogued, used. And then he went back to his table. Evelyn picked up a fresh napkin from the dispenser and began blotting the spilled coffee. Her hands, she noticed with a distant kind of surprise, were perfectly steady. Across the cafe, one of the younger bikers, a kid who couldn't have been older than 22, with the self-conscious swagger of someone who hasn't yet committed fully to what is becoming, pulled out his phone. He angled it toward Evelyn's booth. The small red dot of a recording app appeared on his screen. He was recording her. He thought it would be funny. He thought Reza was about to give him something worth keeping. He had no idea that what he was about to capture would end up as evidence in a federal criminal case. Because Reza had already made his decision. And decisions like his, the kind made by men who have never faced consequences, have a momentum that very few things can stop. At 9:53 in the morning, Evelyn Carter picked up her phone and checked the screen. No message from Caleb. But he'd said 10 o'clock. 7 minutes. She set the phone face down on the table and looked at the door. That was when Reza stood up again. He walked toward her booth with the slow, deliberate stride of someone performing for an audience. His men had gone quiet in a different way now. Not the casual silence of people waiting for something funny, but the taut, watchful silence of people who know they are about to witness something that can't be taken back. A few of them leaned forward. One looked at the door, checking the exits, the way people do when they're calculating risk. Two of the cafe's other customers, the older men at the counter, had already put money on the bar and were moving quietly toward the door. The mother with the little girl had her coat on. Only the young woman with the laptop hadn't moved. She'd closed the laptop lid. Her eyes were wide. She was frozen. Reza stopped at Evelyn's table. "Time to go," he said. Evelyn looked up at him. Looked back at the door. 7 minutes. "I'll leave when my son arrives," she said. "You'll leave now." He grabbed her arm. Not roughly, at first. The grip of someone making a point, establishing control, demonstrating ownership of the situation. Evelyn tried to pull her arm back. She was a small woman, 5'2", 130 pounds, and her arm didn't pull free. "Let go of me," she said clearly. Someone at a back table laughed. Evelyn stood up, not because she was complying, but because she was trying to get leverage, to pull away, to find a way out of the grip that had her upper arm pinned. She stood up and she turned toward him and she said again, louder, "Let go." And that was when Razor hit her. There is no good way to describe what a closed fist does to a 75-year-old woman's face. The physics of it are simple and the reality of it is devastating. The impact snapped her head back and to the left. Her glasses, wire-rimmed bifocals she'd had for 3 years, and that helped her read the small text on her phone when Caleb sent photos of places he'd been, left her face at the speed of the blow and hit the floor 6 feet away. Evelyn's legs gave out. She went down between the booth and the table, her shoulder catching the edge of the seat on the way. And then she was on the floor and she was not moving. The sound of it, the impact, her body hitting the tile, echoed through the Beacon Cafe like something physical. Like the sound had weight. People felt it in their chest before they processed it with their minds. For 2 full seconds, nobody in that cafe made a single sound. The child who had been crying near the window had stopped. The young woman with a laptop had pressed both hands over her mouth. The waitress who had tried to warn Evelyn had taken 1 step forward and then stopped, her hand shaking, caught between the urgent animal instinct to help and the cold practical fear of what would happen if she did. Razor looked down at Evelyn Carter on the floor. He didn't look panicked. He didn't look horrified. He looked, if anything, annoyed. The way someone looks when they've broken something they didn't particularly want to break but didn't care enough to prevent. He turned back to his table. "Somebody get her out of here," he said to no one in particular. Nobody moved. The young biker near the back still had his phone recording. His hand was shaking. 30 feet away, through the window, a black pickup truck had just turned into the parking lot. The driver had not seen what just happened, but he was about to walk through a door that would change the rest of his life. Caleb Carter had driven through the night, 14 hours from the naval station in Virginia Beach, pushing the speed limit on the interstate, stopping once for gas and bad coffee, listening to the radio until the stations faded out and then driving the rest of the way in silence. He wasn't tired, or rather, he was, but the kind of tired that 14 years in the Navy SEALs teaches you to overwrite. You don't stop when you're tired. You stop when the mission is complete. The mission right now is simple. See his mother. He'd been overseas for 14 months this time. Longer than usual. There had been a period around month 9 when he hadn't been able to call her for 3 consecutive weeks. Operational reasons he couldn't explain and she didn't ask about. And he thought about her during those 3 weeks in the way that people think about things they're afraid of losing. Constantly. Carefully. With a kind of discipline designed to keep the fear at a manageable distance. She'd been fine, of course. She was always fine. That was one of the things about Evelyn Carter. She had an unshakable quality, a core of calm that he had never fully understood but had spent his entire adult life trying to replicate. Whatever he'd developed as a SEAL, the composure, the ability to function in high-stress environments, the refusal to panic, he believed, privately, that he'd inherited most of it from her. He pulled into the Beacon Cafe parking lot at 9:59 a.m. He noticed the motorcycles, 11 of them, lined up neat. He recognized the patch. He'd grown up in this part of Kentucky, and you didn't grow up here without knowing who the Iron Serpents were, at least by reputation. He made a note of the bikes the way he made a note of everything. Not anxiously, not reactively, just filed for future reference. He climbed out of the truck, stretched his back, rolled his neck once. He was looking forward to coffee in his mother's face and, eventually, approximately 16 hours of uninterrupted sleep. He pushed open the door of the Beacon Cafe. The first thing he registered was the silence. Not ordinary silence. He'd been in enough places to know the difference between the silence of a room at rest and the silence of a room in shock. This was a second kind. The kind where everyone is frozen in the aftermath of something that just happened. The kind where you can feel the violence still in the air, still reverberating, like the room itself is still processing what occurred. The second thing he saw was his mother. She was on the floor, between the booth and the table, on her side, her silver hair fanned out across the white tile. There was blood on her lip. Her glasses were somewhere else. She was not moving. Caleb Carter had been trained for 14 years to control his physiological response to crisis. He'd been shot at. He'd lost teammates. He'd been in situations where his survival depended entirely on his ability to make rational decisions while his body was screaming at him to react. He had done that, again and again, in places most people would never be able to imagine. He stood in the doorway of the Beacon Cafe and looked at his mother on the floor, and for one single second, every piece of training he had failed him completely. He was just her son, just her boy, the kid she'd waited up for on Friday nights. The kid she'd sat across from in a booth just like this one, buying him hot chocolate after Christmas concerts. The kid she had loved with everything she had for 38 years. And someone had put her on the floor. He crossed the cafe in 8 steps. He didn't run. Running creates noise and commotion, and he did not want to create anything yet. He moved fast and quiet, and he knelt beside her, and he put 2 fingers against the side of her neck. Her pulse was there. Strong. Steady. He exhaled once. Controlled. Measured. Mom. Her eyelids flickered. Not conscious, but responding. He looked up at the room. 14 people watched him from various points around the cafe. Some of them looked frightened. Some of them looked away. One of the waitresses had both hands pressed together in front of her mouth in something that might have been prayer. A young woman near the back was white-faced, her laptop closed in front of her. Caleb's voice, when he spoke, was quiet, completely controlled. The kind of voice that, paradoxically, carries further than shouting. Who did this? Nobody answered. He waited. He was very good at waiting. Then the waitress, the one who had tried to warn Evelyn, raised her hand slightly and pointed toward the far end of the cafe, toward a table where 14 men in leather vests were arranged in a semicircle, most of them looking at Caleb now with expressions that ranged from bored to calculating. At the center of the table, in the seat of highest prominence, Derek Razor Malone sat with his arms crossed and an expression on his face that Caleb had seen before, on other people, in other countries, in situations that had ended extremely badly for those people. It was the expression of a man who believed, with complete certainty, that he was the most dangerous thing in the room. He was about to be corrected. Caleb stood up slowly. He did not charge across the cafe. He did not yell. He did not make the kind of dramatic display that the moment might seem to call for. He stood up, straightened to his full height, and walked, calmly, deliberately, toward Razor's table. The room tracked his movement the way a room tracks something that doesn't quite fit the pattern it's been given. There was something about the way he moved that changed the energy of the space. People couldn't have named it, but they felt it. The waitress took a step back from the counter. The young woman near the back pulled her laptop to her chest. The men at Razor's table shifted slightly in their seats. Caleb stopped about 4 feet from Razor's table. He looked at Razor. He said, "You have 10 seconds to walk over to my mother and apologize to her." The silence stretched. Then Razor laughed. It was the laugh of a man who had been laughing at things for so long that it had become reflex, the default response to anything that challenged him. Because in his experience, laughter had always been the correct move. It communicated dominance. It communicated contempt. It told everyone in the room which way the power was running. His men laughed with him. Several of them. The kind of group laughter that isn't really laughter at all. It's a demonstration, a performance, a reminder that they were 14 and this stranger was one. Or what? Razor said. He stood up. At 6'3" and 240, Derek Malone was an objectively large man. He had won fights his entire life partly through skill and mostly through the brute fact of his physical presence, the way certain people simply occupy space in a way that is fundamentally threatening. He squared himself up and he looked at Caleb, and he did what he always did. He tried to make Caleb small with the size of him. Caleb looked at him the way you look at a problem you've already solved. His hands were loose at his sides. His feet were shoulder-width apart. His breathing was even. He was not looking at Razor's eyes. He was looking at a point roughly in the center of Razor's chest, which allowed him to track movement in his entire field of vision simultaneously. This was not a choice. It was training so deep it had become instinct. 10 seconds, Caleb said again. I'll give you 10 seconds to walk out that door, Razor said. While you still can. 3 of Razor's men stood up. Then 2 more. Caleb was aware of all of them. Their positions, their distances, the angles between their bodies and his, the presence of furniture and counter space and exits. He processed all of this in the way that water processes geography, fluidly, automatically, without effort. Razor swung. It was a right hook, heavy, committed, the kind of punch that had ended most of the fights Derek Malone had ever been in. It carried his full weight behind it, and it was aimed directly at Caleb's jaw. Caleb wasn't there. He moved left and slightly forward, inside the arc of the swing, and Razor's fist passed through empty air. The momentum of the missed punch pulled Razor slightly off balance, exactly as Caleb had calculated it would, and before that balance could be recovered, Caleb was already moving. What happened next lasted approximately 11 seconds. Later, the people who were there would try to describe it, to investigators, to reporters, to family members and friends who asked. Most of them gave up. The consistent element in every account was the speed, the blurring, incomprehensible speed of it. 1 second Razor was swinging. The next he was on the floor, face pressed against the tile he had showed no interest in cleaning, his arm pinned behind his back at an angle that made the men around him wince. Caleb was kneeling beside him, one knee on the floor, and his breathing had not changed. The 3 men who had stood up took a step forward, then stopped. One of them, the older one, with the gray in his beard and the practical eyes of someone who had learned to calculate odds, looked at what had happened to Razor and then at Caleb, and something shifted in his expression. He looked at the other 2 men. A decision was made without words. They sat back down. Caleb didn't look at them. He kept his attention on Razor, who was making sounds against the tile, sounds that might have been pain or might have been rage. It was hard to distinguish. From the direction of Evelyn's booth, a sound, a low moan, barely audible. Evelyn was moving, and from somewhere outside, growing gradually louder, the sound of sirens. The story was far from over. In fact, the part that would change everything for everyone in that room, the part that none of them could have predicted, was only just beginning. The waitress, her name was Sandra, and she had worked the morning shift of the Beacon for 9 years, had called 911 at 9:54 a.m., 1 minute after Evelyn hit the floor. She'd made the call from the small bathroom near the kitchen, keeping her voice low, giving the dispatcher the address and a description of what had happened and how many people were involved. The dispatcher had asked her to stay on the line. She hadn't. She'd put the phone in her apron pocket and walked back out because she didn't want to leave Evelyn alone. The first 2 patrol cars arrived at 10:09 a.m. Then a third. What the officers found when they walked through the door of the Beacon Cafe was a scene that took a few moments to fully process. Derek Malone face down on the floor with a man kneeling beside him in a hold that none of the responding officers had seen outside of training videos. 13 members of the Iron Serpent scattered at tables in various states of frozen attention. An unconscious woman beginning to stare in a booth near the door, and an absolutely surreal quality of silence over everything. The lead responding officer, Sergeant Patricia Owens, 15-year veteran, someone who had handled disturbances involving the Iron Serpents on 4 previous occasions, took in the room and made a rapid assessment. She said later that the first thing she clocked was the man kneeling on the floor, and that her first instinct was to be alarmed by him until she noticed that he was kneeling in a position she'd seen once before, in a joint law enforcement and military training exercise at Fort Campbell. She recognized what she was looking at. "Sir," she said, "I'm going to need you to release him and step away." Identifying myself, Caleb said immediately, in the flat, rapid cadence of military protocol. "Caleb Carter." USN. Off-duty. This man assaulted my mother. She's in the booth by the door. She needs paramedics. He released Razor and stood in a single fluid motion and stepped back, both hands visible. Sergeant Owens held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and turned to her officers. Paramedics now. And nobody in this room leaves. What happened in the next 40 minutes was, in some ways, the most significant part of the entire story, though it was also the least dramatic. Because it turned out that Sandra the waitress was not the only person who had documented what occurred. The young woman with the laptop, her name was Keisha, 24 years old, a nursing student working on a research paper in the only cafe near campus with reliable Wi-Fi, had a habit of recording ambient sound while she worked. She kept a small external microphone clipped to the edge of her table and ran audio to her laptop as a background noise generator. When Razor had first approached Evelyn's table, Keisha had quietly switched from audio only to video, angling her laptop screen so the built-in camera was facing the booth. She had 4 minutes and 17 seconds of clear video footage. And then there was the young biker's phone, the one he'd been using to record what he'd thought would be something funny, something he could share later, something that would make him look like he was in the right place at the right time. He handed it to Sergeant Owens without being asked. He was 19 years old, and for the first time in 2 years of riding with the Iron Serpents, he was looking at the situation he'd gotten himself into and feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, afraid of the right things. While the paramedics worked on Evelyn, checking her vitals, assessing the injury to her jaw, getting her stabilized, something else was happening at the back of the cafe. 2 of Sergeant Owens's officers had walked Razor to a patrol car. 3 more had separated the Iron Serpent's members and were taking statements. And Sergeant Owens herself had stepped outside and was making a phone call. She was calling Detective Ray Hollis. Detective Hollis had been the lead investigator on an Iron Serpent's task force for 22 months. He had a file cabinet in his office that was entirely dedicated to the club, 2 drawers full of surveillance reports, financial records, witness statements that had been recanted under pressure, and documentation of 2 assault cases that had gone cold when the victims stopped cooperating. When his phone rang and Sergeant Owens told him that 14 Iron Serpents were currently sitting in the Beacon Cafe with police officers around them, that there was video evidence of a felony assault, and that nobody had lawyered up yet, his response was one word: coming. He was there in 11 minutes. Back inside the cafe, the paramedics had gotten Evelyn into a sitting position on the booth bench. She was conscious. Her jaw was swollen on the left side and she would later be diagnosed with a hairline fracture. But she was alert and she was tracking the room with the focused attention of a woman who had not yet finished processing what had happened to her. Caleb was sitting beside her, his hand over hers. She blinked at him, the slightly unfocused blink of someone without their glasses. And then her face rearranged itself into something soft. "Caleb," she said, "is that you?" Her voice was rough. Her lip was split. She looked at him the way she had always looked at him, with that particular brand of maternal certainty that he had never fully understood and always depended on. "It's me, Mom." "You're late," she said. He laughed. It was a short, ragged sound, not entirely humor. "I know. I'm sorry." She squeezed his hand. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." But the consequences of that morning were only beginning to ripple outward. And what those ripples would uncover about the Iron Serpents, and about the way violence had been allowed to fester in this community for years, would shock the entire region. Derek Razor Malone was arraigned on charges of aggravated assault and elder abuse 4 days after the incident at the Beacon Cafe. His bail was set at $250,000. He didn't make it. The Iron Serpent's attorney, a man named Burkett who had represented the club in 4 previous matters, arrived at the hearing and argued that his client had no prior felony convictions and posed no flight risk. The judge looked at the video evidence from Keisha's laptop and the audio from Sandra's pocket dial and denied bail. Razor went to a cell at the county detention facility, where he would remain for the next 11 months while his case wound through the court system. He was not alone for long. Detective Hollis had spent 22 months building a case. What the incident at the Beacon Cafe gave him was something he had not been able to obtain through surveillance alone. Living witnesses who were suddenly very willing to talk. The 19-year-old biker who had handed over his phone. His name was Marcus, and he had grown up in Millbrook, the same town as Evelyn, and had joined the Iron Serpents at 17 under circumstances that his public defender would later describe in detail for the court, became a cooperating witness. He told investigators things they had suspected and things they hadn't. He named names. He described transactions. He identified locations. In the 6 weeks following the Beacon Cafe incident, law enforcement agencies executed search warrants at 4 properties associated with the Iron Serpents regional chapter. They recovered illegal firearms. They recovered financial records documenting an extortion operation that had been running for at least 3 years, targeting small businesses across 2 counties. They found evidence connecting 2 members to an assault case that had gone cold in 2021. The victim, a restaurant owner named Torres, had recanted his statement after receiving a visit that left him with 2 broken fingers. Torres, informed that the men who had visited him were now in custody and facing federal charges, agreed to give his original statement back. 11 members of the Iron Serpents regional chapter were indicted on federal charges within 4 months of the incident. The club's local operations, which had been running with impunity for 11 years, collapsed within 6. Caleb stayed in Millbrook for 3 weeks, the longest stretch of uninterrupted time he'd spent at home in years. He drove his mother to doctor's appointments and sat with her through the jaw x-rays and the hearing tests and the follow-up visits. He fixed the gutters on her house. He repainted the front porch. He cooked dinner, badly, and made her laugh about it. He didn't talk much about what had happened at the cafe. Neither did she. They were both, in their different ways, people who had learned to process experience through action rather than analysis, to keep moving, to fix what could be fixed, to let the rest settle on its own. One evening in the 3rd week, they were sitting on the newly painted front porch, watching the light change at the end of the street, and Evelyn said, "I wasn't scared, you know, in the cafe, before it happened." Caleb looked at her. "I know," he said. "I should have left," she said. "The waitress told me to." "Yeah, but I kept thinking about what I used to tell my students." She was quiet for a moment. "About not letting the bully win by walking away." "You've told me that one," Caleb said. "Apparently I believe it." He was quiet too, for a while. "I spent 40 years teaching kids to be strong," she said finally. "I guess I raised one." He didn't answer, but she saw his jaw work, the way it did when he was holding something back. She had been watching that jaw work for 38 years. She knew what it meant. She put her hand on his arm. They sat like that until it got dark.